Minister of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Dr Jamie Wallace.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to answer questions 1, 7, 13 and 17 together. We have introduced measures to tackle barriers faced by SMEs in the procurement process. Last financial year, we spent almost £2 billion more with SMEs than we did in the preceding year.
Dr Jamie Wallace.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In my constituency of Bridgend in South Wales, the SME market will be absolutely key to making a success of Brexit. Will my right honourable friend commit to working with devolved administrations so that all parts of the UK will see progress made when it comes to SMEs accessing government contracts?
Minister.
Well, can I firstly congratulate my honourable friend on all the work he has been doing to open up opportunities for his constituents, in particular SMEs and entrepreneurs. I do commit, and I have already had conversations with the devolved nations. The contract finder that the Department has set up, offering greater transparency about those opportunities, is just one way that we are assisting, and I'd be happy to meet with him to discuss other ways we can support his efforts to ensure all his constituents have the maximum opportunities.
Angela Richards.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend for her previous answer, and it's great to see her in her place on the front bench. 99% of the businesses registered in Guildford are SMEs. What steps is the Minister taking to simplify the bureaucracy involved and minimise the cost to SMEs of quoting for government business?
Well, can I congratulate my honourable friend on the work that she is doing for all businesses in Guildford. We have committed to removing barriers for small businesses in our commercial arrangements and have already removed the complex pre-qualification questionnaires that people used to have to fill out, even for low-value contracts. And we'll continue to look at other ways we can really ensure that SMEs have maximum opportunities to bid for work.
Shakib Bhatt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome the comments from the Minister. Does the Minister recognise the role that business support organisations play, like the IOD, the FSB, the Chambers of Commerce, and of course the local enterprise partnerships who lead on the growth hubs, in helping to bridge the knowledge gap when it comes to SMEs who have to deal with such difficult processes?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the opportunity to pay tribute to those business organisations, and it's great to see him in his place with so much expertise in this area. They play a critical role, and we must listen to what they are saying and look at ways in which we can increase opportunities for all of their members, and we want to improve on our communications and relationships with those organisations.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Small businesses often tell me that late payments are a significant concern for them when bidding for not just government contracts but all contracts with large companies. What steps can my right honourable friend outline to ensure that there is a level playing field for small businesses when applying and putting forward for government contracts?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. We want SMEs to have confidence knowing that they can bid for work, and the prompt payment measure, which was introduced in September last year, has been a key part of the government's work to focus on breaking down those barriers for small and medium-sized enterprises. Suppliers that don't comply with that will be struck off, and we have done so. There is more that we are looking at. He'll know that there is a debate around actually channeling some fines for those having poor practice as compensation to those small enterprises.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. All the friendly questions from the Whip's office don't hide the reality that this government's had 10 years to get this right. More small businesses than ever have given up trying to win government contracts, and the figures, I'm afraid the figures don't stack up. The government is doing worse now than it was when it came in. So when are they going to stop giving the lion's share of lucrative government contracts to the Carillions of this world and start treating our excellent small businesses fairly?
Well, I noticed there were no facts in that question, Mr Speaker. If you look at the facts, If you look at the facts, you will see that there are a greater and growing number of small and medium-sized enterprises that are actually registering to become suppliers. If you look at actually the share in government departments, there are 12 government departments in particular who are massively increasing the amount of work that they're doing with small enterprises. And rather than criticise my colleagues on these benches, he might like to start standing up for small businesses in his constituency.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think there is unanimity across the House about the need to improve access to government contracts for small and medium enterprises. However, I would also prefer that they were British small and medium enterprises. And what action will the Secretary of State take to amend government procurement regulations so that departments can now start to actually be prioritising British firms, British products and employing British workers?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. We want to. You will know that this administration is very focused on increasing the opportunities that are out there across every part of this country. There are some new opportunities that we will have now, having left the EU, as we design those procurement rules in the future. And I hope that all sides of this House can come together behind that, so we ensure that we have maximum opportunities for every part of the UK.
Jim Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that post-Brexit contracts will be able to add weight and scoring metrics for local builders to keep the money in the local economy?
Well, as he will know, we are looking at what reforms we can bring in, and we have set out the very clear principle that it's not just about the immediate return on investment, it's about the long-term opportunities that particular procurement would open up for every part of the UK. So absolutely, that is what we are doing.
David Davis.
Question number 2, sir.
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Government is committed to introducing voter ID as well as extra postal and proxy voting measures to reduce the potential for electoral fraud, and that's to give the public greater confidence that our elections are secure. So evaluations by both the Electoral Commission and the Cabinet Office of the pilots that we ran showed that these were a success and that public confidence in the electoral system was higher in those areas.
David Davis.
The Minister will be unsurprised to hear I'm unimpressed with this illiberal idea. The Electoral Commission actually says that fraud relating to proxy voting, postal voting, bribery, undue influence or tampering with ballot papers, measures which voter ID cards will have no effect on whatsoever, account for 3/4 of electoral fraud. So what are we doing about that?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have a range of measures coming forward, as I did mention in my earlier part to his answer, and that includes looking at ways that we can improve the security of postal and proxy voting. I think it's important to recognise that electoral fraud in any of its forms is a crime, and that means we should stand by dealing with it. We should be on the side of the victims of such crime, who have their voices taken away, stolen, indeed, by such fraud. And I do think that is a very good reason why it was part of our manifesto, which I gently remind my right honourable friend we both stood on.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, those citizens who have their voices taken away because they don't have photographic ID are also victims. But since the Minister is concerned about fraudulent votes, can't you tell the House how many fraudulent votes were prevented in each of the pilot areas?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've already set out, we have evaluations of those pilots which do set out a range of data. It is not the kind of question that can be easily answered, and I hope the more cerebral members of the House will understand that. That is because it is hard to put a figure on crime that is deterred. Now, what the Labour front bench really has to answer here is whose side they are on. In the dying days of this Labour front bench, Mr. Speaker, where the Leader of the Opposition employed a convicted electoral fraudster in his office, which side is the Labour Party on?
Michael, I couldn't cope. William Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I say what a pleasure it is to see such a well-stocked Treasury bench for these Cabinet Office questions, and how much I am looking forward to working with them. And I'm sure that feeling is mutual, Mr. Speaker. But with reference to the excellent Conservative manifesto of my honourable friend, the government have said that they will be setting up a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission, which these matters will pertain to. So could I ask my honourable friend to expand on the scope and remit and the timing of that commission?
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And can I first of all welcome my honourable friend to his post as the new chair of the Select Committee. I very much look forward to working with him on that, as do, of course, all the members of the team here this morning. Now, the commission that he refers to will examine the broader aspects of the Constitution in more depth and put forward proposals to restore trust in our institutions and in how our democracy operates. We will be able to bring forward full details in due course. It does require careful consideration, and I'm absolutely confident we will have a high-quality discussion with the Select Committee on those proposals.
Please, sir.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now that we have honoured the wishes of the British people and got Brexit done, we will be publishing later today detailed aspects of our future relationship with the European Union. I'll be making a statement after these questions, and formal negotiations will begin next week.
I thank the Minister for his response. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the negotiations that begin next week, no one knows what the government's bottom line is, and we will only find out later this year. But could the Minister explain to the House today why on earth this government believes that the reputational damage that will be inflicted, not just in EU capitals but around the world, as a result of casually reneging on a number of commitments set out in a political declaration that was signed in good faith with the EU after the recent general election, is a price worth paying?
Secretary of State.
Well, I have great respect for the honourable gentleman, but I'm afraid his question is wholly misconceived. We have absolutely no intention of doing anything other than honouring the withdrawal agreement, honouring the protocol that we've signed, and making sure that the political declaration's aims of ensuring that we have a comprehensive free trade agreement with no tariffs, no quotas and no quantitative restrictions is achieved.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Does he think that the EU has spotted that we've actually left and no longer need to negotiate our terms of release?
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend, I think, makes a very good point. There are a range of views, a spectrum of opinions in European capitals, but I think that the pennies, the pfennigs and the centimes are dropping as a result of the Prime Minister's speeches and the lecture recently given by the Prime Minister Sherpa David Frost.
Chris Elmore.
Before, sir.
Anybody? Number 4. Johnny.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll take question 4 and 21 together. Veterans offer a vast range of skills and talent to employers, and we want to see more of them working throughout the economy. We're making it easier for veterans to join the civil service, introducing a national insurance break for veterans employers, and investing £5 million in Job Centre Plus Armed Forces Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is concerning that 18% of UK businesses surveyed said they would be unlikely to take on former armed forces personnel because of negative perceptions around those who served in the armed forces. Both he and I know that actually the armed forces bring about skills for life and can be brought into different sectors. I warmly welcome the Cabinet Office decision to guarantee former armed forces personnel interviews if they meet essential criteria. Something similar has been done in my Bridgend County Borough Council area, where they equally now guarantee employer interviews if they meet key criteria. So what more can the Minister do, and indeed make representations to the Chancellor, Duchy of Lancaster, to ensure that these schemes are implemented right across government?
So the whole concept of the Office for Veterans Affairs is to make the experience of being a veteran in this country equal across the country. We're introducing this scheme later on this year. We're also bringing in legislation to ensure that the Armed Forces Covenant is implemented correctly across the country so that no veteran can suffer a disadvantage because of their service. This Prime Minister has shifted the dial on what it means to be a veteran in this country, and I'm determined to make this the best place on earth to be an Armed Forces veteran.
Durham Henry.
Mr. Speaker, does my honourable friend agree with me that the ex-service personnel already working in the civil service bring invaluable skills and experience learned from the armed forces, and guaranteeing veterans interviews for civil service jobs will boost the employment prospects for the residents of Broxtowe and improve the civil service?
Minister.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend and thank him for his question. It's clear that we are moving in this country away from this idea that we give veterans a job just to keep them busy and actually recognise the incredible skills and attributes they bring to any job in society from 10 and 15 years over pretty hard combat over the last few years. I pay tribute to those in the civil service and those who lead the way for others to come through behind them.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I ask my question, with permission, my honourable friend for Chester and I will be leaving this session early to take part in an Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme visit. I'm sure the House will understand that no discourtesy is intended. The Forces in Mind Trust reports that veterans experience a postcode lottery when looking for work, with less than half in the north saying it was easy to find employment. Is the Minister assured that support for veterans is being sent to where it is needed most to tackle this regional inequality?
Minister.
So regional inequality is a key factor of what the Office of Veterans Affairs is trying to do. Today we have the latest figures out from the Career Transition Partnership. We've got more people going into work and education than ever before. In fact, you are more likely to be in employment now if you've been a veteran, but we are not complacent about that in any way. There is no reason why anybody coming out of the military can't go into having a job, which is the single biggest transformative factor in improving their life chances.
Peter Gibson.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will take questions 5 and 9 together. This government is committed to level up across the UK, relocating roles to the regions and nations of the UK. The Places of Growth programme within Cabinet Office is driving the necessary planning within departments and public bodies, with a commitment to relocating 3,000 roles within public bodies already secured.
Right honourable friend for that answer, and I welcome her to her place. Darlington remains a transport hub for our entire region, thanks to the hard work of our excellent Combined Authority Mayor, Ben Houchin. Teesside Airport has reopened the Tees Valley to the rest of the country and to international interest. Given its international links, its excellent rail, road and air connections, will my right honourable friend consider Darlington and the Tees Valley as a location for public bodies?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to start by paying tribute to Ben Houchin and all his excellent work as a Tees Valley Mayor, and also my honourable friend in highlighting the strengths of Darlington. Within Darlington, there are already approximately 800 civil servants and 29,000 across the North East. Given these strengths, the North East region will certainly benefit from the relocation of civil service roles under the Places of Growth programme.
Steve Dubble.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Minister to her place. With 650 miles of the most beautiful coastline in the country and a fishing industry desperately keen to make the most of the opportunities of Brexit, does my honourable friend share my view that Cornwall would be a great location for the Marine Management Organisation to be based?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to congratulate my honourable friend for making sure that Cornwall's voice is well and truly heard. Our focus is on relocating civil service roles in public bodies across the UK. As part of this, we're ensuring any functions repatriated following EU exit are established in the regions and nations of the UK. My honourable friend will be reassured that the Marine Management Organisation already has several offices in the South West, including one in Cornwall.
Philip Oliver.
A sixer.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Office of Veterans Affairs is staffed by civil servants, 2 of whom, including the Director of Veterans. I myself am a veteran, have seen firsthand the need to support our veterans. But it's also setting up a Veterans Advisory Board which includes veterans representatives from academia, business and the charity sector.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable and gallant friend, the Minister, will recognise that veterans represent the very best of selfless service to our country. And no one quite understands veterans' needs than veterans themselves. So what plans does he have to increase A, the number of veterans in his department, and B, the number of disabled veterans?
So people come and work in the Office for Veterans Affairs based purely on what they can add to the organisation. We've got a number of veterans who are working there. At the moment, we are still conducting a recruitment process into certain roles, but it is an embryonic organisation that is finding its way through government, and I look forward to giving my honourable friend an update in writing later on in the year.
James Sunderland.
Question 8, please, Mr. Speaker.
Richard.
I will learn how this works, don't worry. This government is providing the best mental health support for veterans, spending £10.2 million a year on veterans' mental health services through the Transition, Intervention and Liaison Service and the Complex Treatment Service.
Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for his previous answer. Could I ask him, please, how the government is currently helping veterans transition back into civilian life, and also on any new initiatives which may be in the pipeline?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to his service. Veterans' mental health care in this country is now fundamentally changing, and the nation is finally realising its inherent responsibility to those who served. We're rolling out a comprehensive NHS treatment programme through CTS, TILS, the high-intensity service, beyond which there will be space for every single brilliant third sector organisation in this country to contribute. I'm absolutely determined that we will have the world's best mental health care for our veterans in this country, and I look forward to updating him in due course.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will recognise that mental health in terms of veterans also goes into retirement. And I wonder if he agrees with me it's now time to exempt the ward disablement pension for those veterans who access it to improve both their income and opportunities and their mental health in the long term.
Yeah. Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Pensions is a complex area that we are constantly looking at, and there are a number of schemes over the years that have advantaged certain groups and disadvantaged others. It's something I have a continual conversation with to make sure that the Armed Forces Covenant means something in this country, that having served, you have a special place in this nation's heart, and we look after people in the way that they deserve.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, I have an excellent idea which should be in the pipeline, further to my honourable friend's earlier question, because the single biggest barrier for some veterans improving their mental health is getting and keeping a place to live, because disgracefully we have veterans who are homeless. Will my honourable friend consider supporting, and the Cabinet Office supporting, a pilot project together with the Ministry of Defence, the Department for Work and Pensions, and indeed the Ministry of Justice, to turbocharge the excellent work already being done by the Community Self-Build Agency in this area?
So it'll be no surprise I'm a huge fan of the CBSA, the Community Self-Build Agency. They've done some incredible work in my own constituency of Plymouth. We must be careful on this idea of homeless veterans. In my experience and extensive studies, it's not quite as it's represented in the media, but one is one too many. And I'm determined, with the rough sleeping initiative announced today as well, to zero in. There should be no veterans in this country sleeping rough on the streets, and we're determined to get there.
Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm aware that suicide in veterans is normally lower than the civilian cohorts. However, in the last 6 months, I've noticed, and you'll be aware, that this has changed. Included my old platoon commander and several other people I serve with have since committed suicide. What are you doing to support this veterans in this area?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his service. Suicide is an immensely complex area. It's something I'm working on every single day. He is right that traditionally you are less likely to take your life if you have served in the military, but we are experiencing at this time a cluster of events, and we are working every day to understand why these are taking place. I meet with the families of those who have been through this journey, and we are determined to make sure that in every situation we have done everything possible. Each one of these is a tragedy not only for the family and the individual, but for the military as an institution, and I can assure him we are spending every waking moment trying to deal with this current cluster and series of events in this area.
Lloyd Russell-Moore.
Number 10.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Speaker, we don't intend to grant the rights that the question refers to. The Representation of the People Act sets out which non-UK nationals resident in the UK can vote in our parliamentary elections. This is restricted to citizens from Commonwealth countries, which includes Malta and Cyprus, and the Republic of Ireland, who meet residency requirements in the UK.
We currently give Commonwealth citizens who may have been here only 1 month and have no reciprocal rights for British citizens in Commonwealth countries the right to vote in this country. Why do we not give the right to vote for EU citizens that might have lived here for 20 years, paid tax throughout that time? Does the government not believe in representation and taxation?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's right, first of all, here actually to pay tribute to the contribution that EU citizens do and have made to our country and will continue to do in the future. And as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and other ministers have set out, we welcome those contributions. We are making the settlement scheme available the settled status scheme available in order to further that contribution to the life of our nation. But it is also the case that, so far as we are aware, actually, no other EU member state currently allows non-nationals to vote in national elections, beside Ireland's, which has a long-standing bilateral agreement with the UK. So we do think our approach is a reasonable one.
Cat Smith.
Speaker, in the Minister's answer, she acknowledged the contribution that EU citizens have made here in Britain. And, of course, EU citizens currently under transition have the right to vote and stand for election at local level. Many EU nationals are currently serving as local councillors up and down this country for all political parties. What commitment can she make that those EU nationals who currently serve in local government as locally elected councillors will be able to continue to serve their term of office, complete their term of office, and will she be able to give them any guidance as to whether or not they'll be able to seek re-election and their communities be able to re-elect them to continue to serve the communities that they're currently doing so?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am absolutely confident the Honourable Lady is a close reader of all parliamentary questions that are submitted to this House and answered to this House, and she will already know that we have placed on record the answer to that question, which is that those who are elected to office will be able to serve their full term. That will also apply to those who were elected before 2020. As I say, I have put this out in answer to an earlier parliamentary question so that the House is clear. That is that EU citizens will be able to vote and stand in the May elections coming up this year.
Owen Thompson.
Number 11, please.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Code of Conduct for Special Advisers clearly outlines the standards of behaviour and conduct required of Special Advisers throughout their appointment. Where it may be suspected that an individual has failed to meet those standards, agreed disciplinary processes are carried out in line with the terms of the Model Contract for Special Advisers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Code of Conduct says that Special Advisers must not involve themselves with controversy. After calling for weirdos, misfits and PJ masks, Dominic Cummings hired someone who's promoted eugenics. How is this acceptable?
Here, and Michael should...
Mr. Speaker, there is little to add to what the Prime Minister already said on this matter yesterday, which is that those views of Mr Sabisky have no place in this government. Mr Sabisky himself has left the employment of government. I don't think there is more to be said on that matter other than that they are not my views either.
John Trickett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And talking of Mr Sabisky, no doubt that the Minister does agree with the Business Minister who said that his views were offensive and racist. But then, how come such a man was employed to work in Downing Street?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do not think there is anything to be gained here by going into individuals' employment instances. I can assure the House once again that those views are not shared by anybody on the Treasury bench, and I'm sure we would all agree on that.
John Trickett.
Thank you. Well, that's all waffle, isn't it? The truth is that a right-wing extremist sat in official meetings with the Prime Minister and with defence staff, and that is the fact. When the political operation in Number 10 is out of control, that's a problem for politicians, the front bench. But when the vetting system breaks down or is sidestepped, isn't it a problem for the national security?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, does the Labour Party honestly expect me to say from this dispatch box that the vetting system does not work? That would be a breach of national security. I am not going to do any such thing. He ought to ask better questions than that.
Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't one of the ways to solve the problem regarding the issue that the question raises is have special advisors, or at least senior special advisors, who in some cases are more powerful than cabinet ministers? Why don't we do what we do with other appointments, have pre-appointment scrutiny and make the candidates appear before a select committee before their appointment?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I already referred to in my opening point on this question, the Code of Conduct is very clear about what is required, the model contract likewise, and there it is that, and it is found in those documents. It is found in those documents the appointment procedure for special advisers. The fact is that there are. The fact is that ministers take decisions. The Prime Minister takes decisions about who is to be appointed in his team. That is as it should be. Ministers decide and advisers advise. And whilst I welcome his considered point about the processes that could be added to this, I think the processes in place are already adequate, and again, this has been answered already by the Prime Minister yesterday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Minister's just been very clear that ministers and indeed the Prime Minister decide, and she'll be familiar with the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, the Code for Ministers, and of course the Code for Special Advisers, which says very clearly in Section 9, all appointments of special advisers require the prior written approval of the Prime Minister. So did the Prime Minister give prior written approval for Andrew Sabisky? Yes or no?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's not the right question because Mr. Sabisky was a contractor.
Felicity Buchan.
Number 12, please.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer questions 12, 16 and 18 together. The Government is committed to delivering value for money, including from the additional £100 billion of investment in infrastructure that we have recently announced. This means that spending won't just be narrowly focused on where it brings the highest immediate economic return, but also on where it may unlock productive potential in the future.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you. In London, under the stewardship of TfL and the Mayor of London, Crossrail is £2.5 billion over budget and 2.5 years behind schedule. Will my right honourable friend ensure that these mistakes are not made elsewhere in the country?
Well, I know this is a frustration for her constituents. The Infrastructure and Project Authority has worked with the Department of Transport and across government to identify and implement the key lessons to be learned from such major projects. And the authority provides challenge that is fair and accurate through an independent assurance review of major government projects.
Chris Loader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend assure me of the Government's commitment to vital rail infrastructure funding for Dorset and surrounding counties when we have a 3-hourly rail frequency in our county and it takes us 3 hours to get to London almost as well?
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend on both his election but also, as the whole House is aware, him going above and beyond the call of duty and ensuring that his constituents could use train services in the recent strikes. As I say, we are investing an additional £100 billion in infrastructure, and we're looking to make sure we're prioritising the right projects, taking a whole network and whole life value approach, and his representations have been well made and they are being listened to.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that HS2 has been approved, how will my right honourable friend absolutely ensure, if necessary working with ministers from other departments, that costs are firmly controlled so that all taxpayers nationwide, including in the Aylesbury constituency through which this line unfortunately runs, they can be confident that they have received value for money?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very valid point, and the Department of Transport is leading, obviously, on the delivery of HS2. The Infrastructure and Project Authority will continue to work with them to support the delivery of this initiative through expert advice and challenge in those independent assurance reviews. And the recent review and recommendations into HS2 are very focused on ensuring that costs are controlled and there will be no further delays.
Martin.
Number 14.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have regular meetings with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, covering a number of issues, not least of which are our border arrangements. And import controls are necessary to keep our borders safe and secure and to ensure that we treat all partners equally, especially when it involves collecting the right customs, VAT and other excise duties.
Martin Day.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the Minister answering the question. During the referendum, however, the Chancellor Duchess said we would be part of a free trade zone from Iceland to the Russian border, with full access to the EU market. But this month he's been clear that we will lose frictionless trade and that will introduce red tape and vast impacts on our businesses. How can businesses trust his future pronouncements, and can he clarify when he abandoned the idea of frictionless trade?
The whole point of our negotiations with the European Union now that we have left is to ensure that we do have a comprehensive free trade agreement which ensure that there will be no tariffs, no quotas or quantitative restrictions that is entirely consistent with the broader approach towards free trade which does indeed exist from Iceland to the Russian border.
Beth Winter.
Number 15, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
No.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you will be aware, my country of Wales, along with Scotland, has already passed legislation to give young people aged 16 the vote. It's a positive move and is the right thing to do, enabling young people to engage in the political process and influence decisions affecting their lives. Surely it's time that you followed our excellent lead and listened to what young people want. It's their future after all.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for making that point, and of course it's in...
was a grouping that you failed to mention. You were too quick with the no, and I think if you could say you'd take the other question as well would be helpful. Second.
No and no.
No and no, not taking
No, we need the number.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will take questions. If you let me, I will take the question from the member for Weaver Vale as well as the question from the member for Cunnan Valley. And I'm afraid it's a no to both.
Mike Innsbruck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, if it's good enough for the Welsh, it's good enough for the Scottish, then why on earth are 16 and 17-year-olds not entitled to the vote in England and indeed in Northern Ireland? This is a question of equality. If you go to war for the country, if you can pay your taxes for the country, then extend the franchise from Peterloo to extending the franchise to the women through women's suffrage. The North West has a proud history of extending the franchise. Come on, do the right thing for the English minister. Give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote, and indeed in Northern Ireland as well.
Secretary of State.
That was a brilliant question in the style of Orator Henry Hunt at Peterloo. But I'm afraid that we have to accept that in this country, in our United Kingdom, that devolved administrations, they quite rightly make decisions within their competence, but the UK government has no intention of altering the franchise in the way that he suggests. We are getting on with the people's priorities, investing in our NHS, investing in fighting crime, improving education and levelling up the economy. These are more important than constitutional changes.
Rob Roberts.
Question 20, sir.
Minister.
The Government has a commitment to pay 90% of valid and undisputed invoices from SMEs within 5 days. Departments also have a non-exec director responsible for prompt payment, and suppliers now risk being excluded from winning large government contracts if they cannot demonstrate the prompt payment in their supply chain.
Rob. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for that answer. Following on from responses to my honourable friends earlier regarding small and medium-sized businesses, those businesses' cash flow is obviously the most important factor in their survival. So what assurances can my right honourable friend give me that the timely payment will always extend further down the chain so that those small and medium-sized businesses in my Delling constituency are able to plan ahead with confidence?
I can give him those assurances. We do take those things into account, and I can tell him that as far as the Cabinet Office is concerned, and of course many other departments across government, we are meeting the target on 5 days payment, and in 99% of cases all invoices are paid within 30 days.
Right, we now come to topical questions. Rosie Duffield. Not here, so I'll know Owen Thompson.
Question 2.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Next week we'll be starting negotiations with the EU on a future relationship, and I'll shortly make a statement to the House on our approach. But whatever the outcome of these negotiations, the transition period will end at the end of this year. We're working closely with businesses and border groups on preparations for the end of the transition period, and I'll be meeting with representatives from our ports, freight and haulage sectors later today. I also want to take the opportunity to welcome to the front bench my strengthened and hugely talented ministerial team, and I look forward to working with them to deliver on our priorities in the months ahead, overseeing the transition period, strengthening the integrity of our precious union, ensuring our constitution is fit for the 21st century, and reforming our civil service and our public sector in line with the people's priorities.
Owen Thompson.
Mr Speaker, in Scotland, the SNP's Scottish Government's groundbreaking legislation ensures everyone who chooses to make their home in Scotland can vote, including refugees and EU citizens. This follows up enabling votes at 16, which the Government continued to oppose here. Will he now look to follow the lead of the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament towards a more inclusive democracy, or has this Government given up entirely on democracy?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for outlining the approach to the franchise which the Scottish Government takes. But I think one of the most important lessons that democracy teaches us is that we must respect votes. And of course, Scotland voted to remain part of the United Kingdom in the referendum in 2014, and I'm afraid his party still refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of that referendum.
Angela Richards.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to hear my right honourable friend affirm his commitment to strengthening our precious union. Would he be happy to expand on how he would like to do that?
Can I thank my honourable friend for asking that question? The truth is that our United Kingdom is proof positive that a union of nations is stronger together, and it's important that we ensure that the benefits of our union are spread equally, and that means making sure that public sector jobs are deployed effectively in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. It also means that the strength of our exchequer, the foundation that our economy provides for human flourishing across these islands, all of these things are reflective of the strength of our union, the single most successful political union and enterprise that anyone has seen on this earth, and that is why it is so important that we fight for it, from Fermanagh to Forfar and to every part of England and Wales as well.
Cat Smith.
Why is the Secretary of State scared of 16 and 17-year-olds?
Secretary of State.
As the father of a 16 and a 17-year-old, I can assure you I'm not in the least scared of them.
Katina.
I'm very proud to be part of a party that's delivering on leaving the EU and that's investing billions in our health and education sectors. Could my right honourable friend outline the steps his department is taking on public procurement to make sure that that money is spent wisely?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that excellent question. She will be aware that leaving the EU is a golden opportunity to reform our procurement rules. We must cut red tape, we must drive innovation and make it easier for small businesses to win those public sector contracts. And we're going to achieve this by creating a bespoke system for British businesses that also complies with our international obligations.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary and explicitly the Secretary of State on this question, what role has Dominic Cummings have in the Cabinet Office, and can he outline his professional and personal relationship with him?
Secretary of State.
Well, the gentleman concerned is a special advisor who works for the Prime Minister. All special advisors work for the Prime Minister. I have the highest regard for the special advisors who do such a wonderful job supporting the government and the delivery of the people's priorities.
Pete Wishart.
Yesterday, the former Chancellor said he had resigned because of the interference of Dominic Cummings in the working arrangements of what is the second Office of State. Never before has such a senior member of government resigned because of the dictates of an unelected official. Is it now Mr Cummings and his weirdos and misfits that are running this government? How many other Sabiskis are lurking around in government departments? And how does the right honourable gentleman now fit in to the operation and the mechanics of government?
Secretary of State.
Again, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question? Forgive me. Only a matter of time, I suspect. But the broader point is that the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, and Number 10 work seamlessly together in order to ensure that the wishes of the British people, as expressed in the last general election, to strengthen our United Kingdom, to level up our economy, and to make sure that people have the opportunity to excel in every sphere, that work is carried on with harmony, unity, and energy.
David Davis.
Given the ridiculous bluster and sabre-rattling we've heard from the European Commission in the last few days, what assessment has the government made of the damage the European Union would do to its own economy if it denied itself access to the United Kingdom market?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a characteristically acute point. It is the case that the European Union exports more in goods to the UK than we export to the EU. Were some voices, and I stress the minority of voices in the European Union, to prevail, and were they not to progress these negotiations in the way I'm sure that we would all want to see, then there would be damage to the EU's economy, and that is the last thing that I would want to see.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government intend to legislate for the proposals in the 2018 review of parliamentary constituency boundaries, or conduct a new review?
Mr. Speaker, we were clear in our manifesto that we are committed to equal and updated boundaries, and we will be bringing forward proposals in due course as to how to meet that commitment.
William Ragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In February 2019, the Deputy National Statistician said that for the census to go ahead as planned in March 2021, the legislation needs to be passed this April. Does my honourable friend agree that delays to the laying of the census order now mean it's impossible for that legislation to be passed before April? And what are they doing to ensure the census will take place in March next year?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has clearly already got himself into the detail of the department in the most admirable way that we would expect from the new chair. He is right that this legislation is pressing, and he is absolutely right that behind it sits a very large programme being delivered by the UKSA, on which I work closely with that body. We will be bringing forward the order very shortly to Parliament, and I look forward to its scrutiny in this place so that we can have a successful census in 2021.
Bill Estes.
Was Andrew Sabisky recruited to work on the Defence and Security Review, which the Prime Minister announced yesterday? Yes or no will do.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Sabisky was dismissed before the review embarked on its work.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, does the Chancellor of the Duchy not think it's very odd that the very people who want votes for 16-year-olds changed the law so that 16-year-olds couldn't buy a cigarette or go into a tanning salon? And doesn't that reveal just how empty their aspirations are?
Well, Secretary of State.
In typically pithy fashion, my honourable friend draws attention to the fact that when we're looking at the whole question of when people reach the age of maturity, the landscape is a complicated one. The last Labour government, led by Ed Balls, introduced the raising of the participation age in education to ensure that 17 and 18-year-olds had to be in employment, education or training. That was a welcome recognition of the need to ensure that we supported young people to be everything that they can be at the appropriate moment. This government is committed to ensuring that young people have the right opportunity, but it is important to acknowledge that, for example, even though young people can apply to join the services at the age of 16, they cannot be deployed in a battlefield situation until they are at least the age of 18. So it is important when discussing 16, 17 and 18-year-olds to appreciate the complexity of the position and to show sensitivity when discussing these matters.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State would agree with me that when it comes to Andrew Sabisky, we should call a spade a spade. Can the Secretary of State confirm whether someone who is appointed to the government as a political advisor, even on a contractor basis, is in any way exempt from the SPAD vetting process or the requirement for Prime Ministerial approval?
As my honourable friend pointed out earlier, there is a difference between special advisers who are appointed by the Prime Minister and work for the Prime Minister and contractors who exist in all government departments.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Why doesn't he prevent enterprises from bidding for government contracts unless they can demonstrate a record of having paid their suppliers on time?
Minister.
Well, they do have to demonstrate this, and if they are already suppliers and they are not complying with the targets that we have set out, they are booted off the supplier list.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I did a quick Google search this morning for government jobs. Other search engines are available, and it came up with dozens of government positions described as inside IR35. Now, this is the worst of both worlds. You get taxed as an employee, but you have no employment rights. Do the Department agree that that's actually an untenable state of affairs for people working for government?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises a thoughtful point. He will be aware that there has been a review led by Her Majesty's Treasury on these rules. I think we would all agree that what we want to see is employees treated accurately and fairly, whichever category they fall in, and of course that the public purse is protected in terms of taxes being correctly brought in and made available for public services. I'll be happy to look in slightly more detail at what he raises if he thinks there's something there beyond that.
Stuart Anderson.
Can my honourable friend tell me what he's doing at the moment about the current combat stress situation?
I pay tribute to Combat Stress, the immense work they've done over many years for those who suffer with mental health challenges when they return from operations. The situation is a difficult situation. There is no doubt that the model of healthcare for our veterans in this country is fundamentally changing to a realisation of the responsibility that the NHS has towards those who serve. Within that model of care, there is a role for everybody, and as we undergo that transition, the services are available, and I'm monitoring the uptake of them every single day.
Rosie Duffield.
Mr Speaker, apologies for not being in my place earlier. Since 2017 and under successive Tory governments, leaks from civil servants have apparently become commonplace. Has the Minister or the Government carried out an assessment as to why so many civil servants now seem to believe it's in the public interest to go behind the backs of ministers to leak information?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that question. It is, of course, the case that civil servants have to abide by the Civil Service Code, and we deprecate the leaking of any government information. I'll reflect hard on the point behind the question that the Honourable Lady makes.
Bernard Jenkins.
Can I declare an interest as a Vice President of Combat Stress? And can I just point out that Combat Stress is facing a crisis because the government is withdrawing its funding for the 1,200 or so veterans that use its services every year. And there is now an incidence of a veteran taking their own life because they were refused treatment by Combat Stress and referred back to their GP. This is a very serious situation. Will my honourable friend please make sure that Combat Stress gets the funding that it needs in order to deliver the care to the veterans that it looks after?
Minister.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend and his work with combat stress. The reality is that combat stress is facing challenges at this time, not exclusively because of challenges around contracts from the government. That is reflected across the third sector as well, because mental health care is changing. We must always be driven by the evidence, what works, and how we can access and treat more and more people as awareness of mental health goes up. I've met with Combat Stress a number of times. I've met with my honourable friend on this issue. I'm happy to continue meeting to find a solution to what is a very difficult problem, which is not always, the answer is not always to these problems throwing the requisite money at it and hoping the problem gets better.
Lord Russell-Moore.
Thank you. The Minister, to my question earlier on, said that no other European country grants non-citizens voting rights. I think that might have been slightly erroneous. Portugal grants Brazilians that meet a certain threshold voting rights at the national level, as does the Nordic Passport Union in Scandinavian countries. So will the Minister think again about our out-of-place system, where people who could have lived here for 20-odd years, paid tax here, even people who could have been born here, are not able to vote here? At least let's open the conversation.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm grateful for that information. To be clear, in terms of what I had said that so far as I was aware, that was the case. So I'm grateful for him for giving two further examples to the debate. And he's right that we should be aware of such examples and have that conversation. But I think the government stance is, as I set out earlier on, which is that we think it is reasonable and right to focus on the voters who are currently enfranchised by the Representation of the People Act. And I would further add that I think citizenship restrictions are commonplace for participation in national elections across not only the EU but actually most democracies. I do think the weight of evidence is with the government's position here. I would add, of course, that we do intend to make sure that British citizens around the world who may have travelled far from Britain but are nonetheless still British citizens should be enabled to vote in elections, and we intend to be taking forward that policy. And this is all to say that we think that we think that that is how our democracy should be run. I look forward to speaking further with him on this. I understand he too has joined the Select Committee, again, as is on the order paper this morning. So I look forward to furthers of these discussions as time goes on.
David Jones.
Stephen. Welsh companies wishing to bid for public contracts in Wales frequently find themselves unable to do so because of EU procurement requirements. Can my right honourable friend confirm that post the implementation period, procurement regulations will be changed to enable Welsh companies to bid for contracts in Wales?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There are some big opportunities for us to change those procurement rules. I have already had conversations with the devolved nations. I'll be visiting the devolved nations very shortly to take forward and to listen to the ideas of businesses to ensure that those new rules and regimes around them reflect their needs.
Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster might want to be very careful with the answers he gives to this House about Mr. Sabisky in relation to the Defence and Security Review, as my honourable friend from Sefton raised a moment ago, because he will well know that there have been teams of civil servants working on that review for some time. It didn't just start yesterday when the Prime Minister announced it. So can he answer a question? Did Mr. Sabisky meet with any of the officials working on the Defence and Security Review? Yes or no?
Secretary of State.
I've no idea.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you. I welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the veterans' interview guarantee. But I've spoken to a number of veterans in Stoke-on-Trent Central, where we have quite a number, and I think that sometimes the issue is pre-employment, so that they need help to prepare for being ready for an interview. Can the Minister give some ideas whether we can support them on that?
So preparing those who've served for civilian life is a huge part of what we do. We put a lot of money into something called the Career Transition Partnership. The statistics out today show that we've got an 86% employment rate, continues to rise year on year. We've got a higher employment rate than the civilian cohort. We're not resting on our laurels, and we will continue to do all we can in that pre-phase before individuals leave service to make sure that they have the best opportunity possible of making the most of their skills when they rejoin civilian life.
We now come to the ministerial statement. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Minister for the Cabinet Office on future relationships with the EU. Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like now to make a statement on the Government's approach to our future relationship with the European Union. Now that Britain has left the EU, we're entering a new chapter in the history of these islands. This Government has honoured the clearly expressed wish of the British people. Their instruction to us, their servants, to secure our departure from the EU has been followed. The votes of 17.4 million people, more than have ever voted for any democratic proposition in our history, were implemented on January the 31st, and we are now on a new journey. As a sovereign, self-governing, independent nation, we will have the freedom to frame our own laws, control our own borders, lower all our taxes, set our own tariffs, determine our own trade relationships, and ensure that we follow the people's priorities on security, the economy, and democratic accountability. Over the next 9 months, we will negotiate a new relationship with our friends and partners in the EU, based on free trade and friendly cooperation. We have today published the approach for these negotiations, and copies of the document, the future relationship with the EU, were made available to members in the Vote Office from 9:30 a.m. Talks with the EU on our future relationship begin next week, and it is our aim to secure a comprehensive free trade agreement, as well as agreement on questions such as fisheries, internal security and aviation. We're confident that those negotiations will lead to outcomes which work for both the UK and the EU. But this House, our European partners, and above all, the British people should be in no doubt. At the end of the transition period, on the 31st of December, the United Kingdom will fully recover its economic and political independence. We want the best possible trading relationship with the EU, but in pursuit of a deal, we will not trade away our sovereignty. The government's vision for the UK's future relationship with the EU was outlined with crystal clarity by the Prime Minister during the general election campaign, and the election result comprehensively confirmed public support for our direction of travel. And in his speech in the Painted Hall in Greenwich on February the 3rd, the Prime Minister laid out in detail how we will reach our destination. The first principle of our approach is that we wish to secure a relationship based on friendly cooperation between sovereign equals. We respect the EU's sovereignty, autonomy and distinctive legal order, and we expect them to respect ours. We will not accept nor agree to any obligations where our laws are aligned with the EU or the EU's institutions, including the Court of Justice. Instead, each party will respect the other's independence and the right to manage its own borders, immigration policy and taxes. The second and allied principle of our approach is that we will seek to emulate and build on the types of relationship that the EU already has with other independent sovereign states. We will use precedents already well established and well understood to ensure that both sides' sovereignty is respected. And by using already existing precedents, we should be able to expedite agreement. We will seek functioning arrangements that the EU will recognise from its many other relationships. So our proposal draws on existing EU agreements, such as the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with Canada, the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, and the EU-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. This approach should enable us to move swiftly towards the goal envisaged in the political declaration agreed last October, in which both sides set the aim of concluding a zero tariffs, zero quotas free trade agreement, or FTA. And as well as concluding a full FTA, we will require a wholly separate agreement on fisheries. We will take back control of our waters as an independent coastal state, and we will not link access to our waters to access to EU markets. Our fishing waters are our sovereign resource, and we will determine other countries' access to our resources on our terms. We also hope to conclude an agreement on law enforcement and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, so that we can work with the EU to protect their citizens and ours from shared threats. But we will not allow our own legal order to be compromised. And by taking back full control of our borders, we can implement measures to make the British people even safer, and we can tackle terrorism and organised crime even more effectively. We also wish to conclude a number of technical agreements covering aviation and civil nuclear cooperation, which will help ensure continuity for the UK on its new footing as an independent sovereign nation. Now, securing agreement on all these questions should not, in principle, be difficult. We are, after all, only seeking relationships with the EU which it has with other nations, relationships that respect the interests and the sovereignty of both partners. And it's in that light that we should view discussions about what has been termed the level playing field. It has been argued that EU demands in this area will make full agreement difficult. Yet there's no intrinsic reason why requirements that both parties uphold desirable standards should prejudice any deal. The United Kingdom has a proud record when it comes to environmental enhancement, workers' rights and social protection. In a number of key areas, we either exceed EU standards or have led the way to improve standards. On workers' rights, for example, the UK offers a year of maternity leave, with the option to convert this to parental leave so that both parents can share care. The EU minimum is just 14 weeks. And on environmental standards, we were the first country in the world to introduce legally binding greenhouse gas emission reduction targets through the Climate Change Act. We were also the first major global economy to set a legally binding target to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the economy by 2050. We will not dilute any existing protections. Indeed, as the Environment Bill debated yesterday demonstrates, we wish to go further and faster than the EU in improving the natural environment. We do not need the EU's permission to be a liberal nation leading the world in the fight against climate change and for social progress. And that is why the UK government seeks an FTA with robust protections for the environment and labour standards. But we do not see why the test of suitability in these areas should be adherence to EU law and submission to EU models of governance. The EU does not apply those principles to free trade agreements with other sovereign nations, and they should not apply to a sovereign United Kingdom. Some argue that we must accept EU procedures as the benchmark because of the scale of UK trade with the EU. But the volume of UK trade with the EU is no greater than the volume of US trade with the EU, and the EU was more than willing to offer zero tariff access to the US without the application of EU procedures to US standard setting. And the EU has also argued the UK is a unique case, owing to its geographical location. But proximity is not a determining factor in any other FTA between other neighbouring states with large economies. It's not a reason for us to accept EU rules and regulations. You need only to look at the USMCA agreement between the US, Canada and Mexico for an example of a trade agreement that does not require regulatory alignment to one side's rules or demand a role for one side's courts. Geography is no reason to undermine democracy. To be clear, we will not be seeking to dynamically align with EU rules on EU terms governed by EU laws and EU institutions. The British people voted to take back control, to bring power home, to have the rules governing this country made by those who are directly accountable to the people of this country. And that is what we are delivering. Mr. Speaker, the negotiations are due to begin next week, led by the Prime Minister's Sherpa David Frost. And I'd like to end by looking ahead optimistically to the coming months. There is ample time during the transition period to strike the right deal for the UK. We hope to reach a broad agreement ahead of the EU Council's high-level summit in June, whereupon we will take stock. We know our proposals are measured and our approach is fair. We know what we want to achieve. We're ready to go. And this government is committed to establishing the future relationship in ways that benefit the whole of the UK and strengthen the Union. We're committed to working with the devolved administrations to deliver a future relationship with the EU that works for the whole of the UK. And may I take this opportunity to reassure colleagues that our negotiation will be undertaken without prejudice and with full respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol. This government will act in these negotiations on behalf of all of the territories for whose international relations the UK is responsible. And in negotiating the future relationship between these territories and the EU, the UK government will seek outcomes that support the territories' security and economic interests and reflect their unique characteristics. And, as the Prime Minister committed to do at the second reading of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, we'll keep Parliament fully informed about the negotiations, and colleagues will be able to scrutinise our progress. Mr. Speaker, this government is delivering on its manifesto commitments with energy and determination. This government got Brexit done, and we will use our recovered sovereignty to be a force for good in the world and a fairer nation at home. We want and we will always seek the best possible relationship with our friends and allies in Europe, but we will always put the welfare of the British people first. And that means ensuring the British people exercise the democratic control over our destiny for which they voted so decisively. That compact with the people is the most important deal of all, and in that spirit, I commend this statement to the House.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the Cabinet Office for prior sight of his statement. He talked about having got Brexit done, but he knows that's not the case. We have taken the first step in leaving the European Union, but Brexit, as he knows, is far from done. And the government's ambition for our new relationship with our most important trading partner is frankly underwhelming. They started with a commitment to securing the exact same benefits, then scaled it back to frictionless trade to protect our vital supply chains. Then it was Canada plus, plus, plus. Now it's Canada so long as that doesn't get in the way of ending our alignment with the standards that we've previously enjoyed. Now, the Minister talked about the government's mandate in the general election, which was based on a withdrawal agreement and a political declaration which says that a free trade agreement will be, and I quote, underpinned by provisions ensuring a level playing field, which they now apparently reject. The Minister spoke of higher UK standards than are required within the EU, and he's right. There are some examples. There are also contrary examples. But EU standards are a floor, not a ceiling. So can I ask the Minister, if the government have no intention of falling below those standards, why are they unwilling to make that commitment? Mr. Speaker, I spent Monday evening with manufacturing companies from across the north of England. They are not worried about alignment. Indeed, they want it. They're concerned about the barriers to trade undermining their position in the crucial European market. Now, I know that the Prime Minister has made his contempt for the views of business well known. But will the government not think again at this crucial moment, because they are taking serious risks with our economy, with people's jobs and with their livelihoods? The Treasury's analysis from November 2018 predicted a Canada-style FTA would shrink the economy by up to 6.4%. Now, I know they've rubbished their own analysis already, but what new analysis have they done? So can I ask the Secretary of State, will the government publish a full economic impact assessment of the deal that they are seeking? And will they also publish the assessment of the other trade deals that he mentioned? A recent FTO revealed the Department for International Trade has commissioned and received but not yet published assessments of the impact on the UK economy, of the FTA with the US, with Japan and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So will he commit to publishing those impact assessments immediately? Now, the government has told us time and again that, the Prime Minister has told us time and again that his Brexit deal represents stability and certainty for business. But in ruling out extending the transition period, the government is taking business from one set of uncertainties to a new set. They're expecting to complete enormously complex negotiations in just 10 months, with a cavalier disregard for the consequences of failing to do so. The Minister's warning to business that customs checks are inevitable and that almost everybody will face extra barriers at the border is deeply concerning. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the one place where the government claims that there will not be checks for GB trade with Northern Ireland is the only place that they have actually so far committed to having them down the Irish Sea. So can the Minister clarify, in the light of the conflicting statements from so many of his colleagues, what will be the extent of checks along the border they have now created down the Irish Sea? Mr. Speaker, Labour wants the best deal for Britain in trade, in security and in all of the other areas mentioned by the Minister. That means maintaining the closest possible relationship with our most important trading partner, and it is on that to which we will hold this government to account.
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his questions and the constructive way in which he approaches these matters. The first thing to stress is that this government is wholly committed to implementing the withdrawal agreement, to respecting and enacting the protocol with respect to Northern Ireland, and also to giving effect to the political declaration, and specifically the political declaration's aim that we secure a comprehensive free trade agreement without tariffs, quotas and quantitative restrictions. He asked specifically about the maintenance of standards and the requirement that we follow EU law and ECJ judgments in order to ensure that workers' rights and environmental protections are there secure. We do not believe that that is necessary. It is not the case that the EU requires of any other sovereign independent state submission to its legal order. Ultimately, the best guarantor of environmental protection and workers' rights is a sovereign UK Parliament determined to lead in the world, as this government is doing in those areas. He asked about manufacturing. It is vitally important that we ensure that our manufacturing sector, like all sectors of our economy, is equipped to take advantage of new economic opportunities. That is what this government is doing. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will be saying more about how we can supercharge every part of our economy when he delivers the budget statement on the 11th of March. But the free trade agreement that we seek should ensure exactly the tariff-free access to markets and, indeed, the provisions on rules of origin that will allow the manufacturing sector to flourish in the future. He makes the point that the need to ensure that negotiations are concluded by the end of the transition period on the 31st of December necessarily means that negotiations will have to proceed at pace. They will. But as I pointed out, and as he acknowledges, because all we are seeking are relationships for which there's already a precedent between the EU and other countries, precedents that exist between the EU and Canada, Japan, South Korea and others, it should be possible to make rapid progress. And I noticed that my good friend, Dr. Martin Zellmeyer, who is now the EU representative in Austria and who previously worked for the President of the Commission, has said that it would be entirely possible to conclude these negotiations in a timely fashion. And Dr. Selmayr and I, not for the last time, are in complete agreement on that issue. And he makes the point about customs checks and a border down the Irish Sea. There will be no border down the Irish Sea. We will make sure that there is unfettered access for Northern Ireland businesses to the rest of the United Kingdom. The problem for the Labour Party, and I acknowledge the sincere beliefs and the commitment of the honourable gentleman to appropriate scrutiny, but the problem for the Labour Party more broadly is that their approach on Europe would mean that we would have no control over our fishing waters, no effective control over our borders, no way of charting our own independent economic destiny. And looking at that proposal, I'm afraid that all I can say, as someone once said, is no, no, no.
Can I tell the host I'm expecting to run this to 11:30, in which case Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his statement, very clear, and his views that the standards that we set are higher than those of the EU, so he won't be demanding that the EU aligns with our standards as we go forward, which is refreshing. Can I also, however, take him to one point? In the withdrawal agreement, he knows that the settlement around Northern Ireland included state aids, and since then the EU has interpreted this as bringing the whole of the UK under the state aids provisions. Could he confirm that in a future agreement which we will make with them, we will not accept that the UK will leave itself under the Court of Justice when it comes to state aids provisions?
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. Of course we must respect the integrity of the protocol, but it is not the case that CJEU should be governing the application of state aid in the way that some have envisaged and which would be quite wrong.
Wayne David.
Thanks very much. The Secretary of State's statement has been strong.
Sorry, it should have been Pete Wishart. There's too many people talking at the chair. Pete Wishart.
That's absolutely fine, Mr. Speaker. What a load of bunkum baloney and codswallop. This is nothing other than a route map to the cherished no deal, the real ambition of these Brexit zealots over there. They're even now prepared to break international law in order to achieve this outcome. But let's dispense with the unicornism and let's try and see if we can start to make sense with the real world and what we're actually dealing with. The EU expect nothing other than the political declaration to be implemented in full. They expect that level playing field to be realised, and they will not accept anything else. How many times does this government need to be told that the UK will not leave with a better deal and arrangement that is currently enjoyed just now? It doesn't matter if it's Canada Plus. It doesn't matter if it's Australia. It doesn't even matter if it's outer space minus. They will have an inferior product at the end of this day and when we have finally got an agreement with the EU. And look at what we're up against. It's the clown shoe UK up against the efficient, effective EU with their negotiating experience. And they're laughing. They're laughing at that, sitting there with the proposals which mean absolutely nothing. They will be trounced by the EU in the negotiating process. Their hard Brexit will do nothing other than hurt my nation. Even with one of these FTAs, our GDP will be hit by 6.1%. And if they get their cherished no deal, the consequences will be absolutely catastrophic for my nation of Scotland. Scotland wanted nothing whatsoever to do with this ruinous Brexit, and we won't accept it. I'm sure, honourable gentlemen who have been laughing and scoffing in this side have seen opinion polls in Scotland. There is now sustained majority support for independence for Scotland. And one of the things that's driving that is all of them saying no to Scotland, for them pursuing their hard Brexit. Scotland's not going to be part of this Secretary of State. We won't accept it. When will you allow us to have a referendum so we could get out of this mad Brexit?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his remarks. The first thing that I would say is, can I use the opportunity of his remarks to place on the record my thanks to Mike Russell for the Scottish Government for the work that he's done along with leaders from other devolved administrations in helping to shape our approach. Of course, it is the case that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Assembly Government will in some areas take a different view from the UK Government, but it's undoubtedly the case that our negotiating position is enhanced as a result of the conversations that we have with our colleagues in the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Government. And indeed a number of changes have been made to our approach and to this document following conversations that I've had with the Scottish Government over the course of the last week. But it is also the case that Scotland, like every part of the United Kingdom, will benefit hugely, not just from our departure from the European Union, but also from the new trading relationships that we will develop with other countries. It is the case, for example, that when we conclude a new free trade agreement with the United States, that Scotland will be one of the sectors that benefits most from the new trading opportunities. But it will also be the case, as the Scottish Government itself has pointed out, that there will be tens of thousands of new jobs created in the northeast of Scotland in the fishing sector as a direct result of our departure from the European Union, jobs that would not be created if we followed the SNP approach of staying in the common fisheries policy. And ultimately, the greatest threat to the prosperity and the security of the people of Scotland is the reckless approach that the Scottish Government takes towards the 2014 referendum, their determination to overturn the settled will of the Scottish people to stay in the United Kingdom. Their approach, I'm afraid, would mean that we would have border posts at Berwick and you would not be able to use the pound sterling in sterling. We must give that madness a miss.
Meg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome my right honourable friend's statement. And on the subject of standards, would he agree with me that those that continue to peddle the line that we somehow need to tether ourselves to the EU's rules and standards are in fact making a case to hold Britain back?
My honourable friend is absolutely right.
Wayne David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Secretary of State aware that 60% of the international exports from Wales go to the European Union? And the Welsh Government has said that there must be a level playing field and frictionless trade with the EU in the interests of the Welsh economy. Is he aware of this?
I'm very well aware of the views of the Welsh Assembly Government, thanks to the excellent work done by Jeremy Miles, their Brexit Minister and Counsel General, and I enjoy the conversations that I have with Jeremy, Mark Drakeford and others in order to make sure that we can work together.
John Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU is a priority. However, can the Minister confirm that we will be also looking to reach free trade agreements with other countries? And can he also confirm that such negotiations either are underway now or will be shortly, and that we do actually have the civil service capacity to reach them?
It's a very good point made by my honourable friend, and yes, we do. The Department for International Trade has a team of trade negotiators, lawyers and other policy experts. It is the case that there have already been a number of informal and formal contacts with the United States, Australia, New Zealand and other participants in the CPTPP, and we will be proceeding at pace with negotiations with partners across the globe in order to forge free trade agreements in the interests of every part of the United Kingdom.
Dr Ruperhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit is clearly far from done. It had cost us £130 billion by January, and the average UK household is £900 worse off. Will the Minister tell us what he estimates that price tag to be at the end of this year? And given the gendered impact of trade, where's the equality impact assessment that their statutory duty requires them to do with these things?
It is the case, if one looks at most of the indices of economic performance, like the measures of increased investment and increased capital expenditure recently, that the United Kingdom economy, following on from the Conservative victory in the general election on the 12th of December, is powering ahead. Indeed, powering ahead in comparison to EU nations. I would like to make sure that we get a comprehensive free trade agreement so that other EU nations can benefit from the dynamism of the UK economy, and that men and women across Europe can benefit from the right economic relationship.
Duncan.
Financial services are critical to the economy of this country, contributing 11% of our total tax take. Will my right honourable friend assure my constituents in Kensington who work in financial services that their interests will be protected during free trade negotiations?
Absolutely. Financial services matter not just in the City of London, but also in Edinburgh, Perth, Leeds, and across the United Kingdom. It's a dynamic and growing sector, and it's important that we make sure that we have the right arrangements for them. We hope that the EU will report by June on the prospects for equivalency in financial services. That was a commitment that was made in the political declaration. It did not appear subsequently in the EU's negotiating mandate, but I'm confident that the EU will, by June, have completed those equivalency assessments.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our future relationship, it's quite important that musicians and performers and so on can move freely and continue to both go to Europe and for European performers to come here on a reciprocal basis. What's his understanding of the government's position in relation to that going forward?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and he will see that in this document there are details on how we can ensure that those who provide professional services, including artists and musicians, can continue to do so at the end of this transition period. It's critically important that the cultural excellence that so many UK musicians are responsible for continues to be available to European nations, and whether it's the Bayreuth Festival or pop concerts in Belgium, we need to make sure that British talent has a chance to shine.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that an agreement on a future relationship by the end of the year is perfectly feasible, and that the EU and its negotiators need to recognise the reality of a sovereign, independent United Kingdom with a strong, dynamic economy?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of EU leaders who have said that a deal is doable because we're operating on the basis of precedent. Then it should be possible to conclude all the necessary agreements. And I should say that having concluded these agreements by the end of this year, we can then move on to deepening the many bilateral and multilateral relationships that we have with our friends and partners in Europe to the benefit of all.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman referred to other deals that he is hoping to emulate. He will be aware that the EU's deal with South Korea took 8 years from the start of negotiations to implementation, and the Canada deal 7 years. Given that the government is seeking a much more comprehensive arrangement than either of those, may I say to him, the proof will be whether his optimism that it can be done and ratified in 10 months remains to be proven. But can he just confirm to the House that if it is not possible to conclude a deal, then we will exit the transition period on the 31st of December with no agreement whatsoever?
Well, we already have an agreement. We have a withdrawal agreement that safeguards the rights of UK and EU citizens, that settles our financial obligations and makes provisions through the protocol for Northern Ireland's position. So we already have an agreement. With respect to the free trade agreements to which he refers, it's obviously more difficult to begin when you are designing a prototype. Now that these prototypes exist and they are no longer prototypes but precedents, it is much, much easier to replicate their provisions.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the last question, some 2 years ago, I attended a presentation complete with slides given by Mr. Michel Barnier, at which he indicated that as things then stood, the only post-Brexit trading arrangements available to the UK were those enjoyed by South Korea and, of course, Canada, which is precisely the relationship that the government is seeking. Since then, the EU seems to have resigned from that position. Does my right honourable friend know why the EU is apparently showing such bad faith?
There are, as my right honourable friend, having served with distinction in government, knows, a range of views across the European Union, but they have now concluded their mandate with unanimity, and we are confident that we can negotiate using our approach and their mandate to reach an appropriate deal similar to the one that he has outlined.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, I have often in this place referred to the concerns of the Highland tourism industry, in particular hotels, about the continuing employment of EU nationals, many of whom are heading homewards, and also the concerns of fish processors in terms of getting their fresh produce to European markets in good time. I wonder if the Secretary of State, who's a good Scot, would consider coming to the Highlands to meet with representatives of these industries. He would be most welcome.
I'd be delighted so to do. Any opportunity to visit the honourable gentleman's constituency is a welcome one. He is absolutely right that the hospitality industry is integral to the success of the Highlands economy, and we want to make sure that in the future that those who provide such a high standard of hospitality have access to the skilled labour they need.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and his very clear message regarding fisheries. But he will know that memories run very deep in our fishing communities, and there is continued great concern because of the way that the fishing industry was treated previously. So will he make absolutely clear to the fishermen in Cornwall and around the country that access to our fishing waters will not be used as a bargaining chip to trade off against other priorities?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Memories of what happened in the 1970s certainly run deep, and for very good reason. And that is why I sought to stress in my remarks that we, as an independent sovereign state, regard control of our own resources as something which we cannot barter away. Of course, we want to cooperate in the management of stocks with our neighbours, but the approach that we will take will be similar to that of other sovereign states or sovereign regimes like Norway, Iceland, and the Faroes, and as an independent coastal state, we will regulate access to our own waters on our terms.
Sir George Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath's commitment to try to secure a comprehensive free trade agreement? Will he accept, though, that many of my constituents who work in the automotive industry are seriously worried about the impact of a potential 10% tariff on motor vehicles, and will he undertake to give a firm commitment to make sure that their interests are as protected as much as possible?
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for making that point. Throughout his time in the House, he's been a strong and consistent and powerful voice for the rights of workers. He's absolutely right that those who work in our automotive sector deserve the best possible future, and it's for that reason that we will seek to avoid any tariffs on cars or on automotive products.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. British farmers are proud to produce food to the highest standards, and the British consumer benefits from this. Can my right honourable friend reassure the farmers and the consumers of my constituency of Broadland that these high standards will be maintained in any free trade agreements?
Absolutely. The agriculture bill, which was being introduced by my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, which is being carried, whose tenure as Environment Secretary was outstanding, and which is being carried forward by my right honourable friend, the current Secretary of State, will ensure that farmers have a firm foundation on which to plan for the future. It is also the case in all our trading relationships that we will make sure there are appropriate protections for the environment and for animal welfare to ensure that the peerless standards which are set by our farmers are used as a badge of excellence to enable them to do even better in the future.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to fishing, can the Secretary of State confirm that fishing fleets and fish processors in Portavogie, my constituency, but also in our Glasgow, Keele and elsewhere, will have the same rights as their fellow fishing fleets and processors in Scotland, Wales and England, and that Northern Ireland will not be disadvantaged by the border down the Irish Sea?
There will be no border down the Irish Sea, and the fishing fleets of Northern Ireland will enjoy all the rights that they deserve, similar, indeed identical, to those of other fishermen and fishers across the United Kingdom.
Crab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Striking a deal is far easier and far more likely from a position of strength. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that, in contrast to 2017, going into these negotiations with clarity, unity, backed up by a strong electoral mandate, should give us all reasons for optimism, not pessimism?
Oh, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. And I've said before from this dispatch box that when you had a 52-48 referendum, when you have 650 different views in this House, not everyone will be satisfied with every aspect of our negotiating approach. But with a united government, a clear approach, a general election mandate, and also with this document being underpinned by clear work by lawyers, trade negotiators and others, I believe that we can secure a deal. And I'm sure that across this House, everyone recognises that we should not make our own personal perfect the enemy of the common good.
Matt Fadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The statement and the document published today shows that the government has made a fundamental choice, which is to prioritise sovereignty over any economic argument or consequence, either for goods or for services. But isn't the danger here that, having made this choice, the government imposes economic consequences for the long term on the country in pursuit of the prize of a sovereignty which it ends up not using very much, because at the end of the day, good standards in environmental and labour market and consumer sectors
actually makes sense.
The Right Honourable Gentleman always makes a thoughtful contribution to our debates, and I do take his point. And it will be for this Parliament and for future Parliaments to decide how our sovereignty is exercised in accordance with the wish of the British people. But the experience of history tells us that those countries which have the maximum amount of control over their own destiny are the best equipped to succeed economically and indeed to ensure a greater degree of equity for all their citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend recognise the distinction between EU regulations and European technical standards, the latter of which are set outside the EU and without a loss of sovereignty by expert bodies, of which the British Standards Institution is one of the most respected and admired in the world? And does he share my hope that British standards expertise will continue to be able to influence European and international standards?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, which reflects the brilliant work that he did in government as business secretary. It is absolutely the case that there are common technical standards in which British experts play a distinguished part, and we will want to ensure, and I know that others will want to ensure, that those common standards can help underpin successful commerce and trade.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister began by saying the government is not asking for anything which doesn't already exist in an existing agreement between the EU and another country, but then gave an answer on financial services, which the document backs up, saying the government is seeking this enhanced equivalence, comprehensive equivalence regime for our major sector. And the two things, Minister, respectively, cannot be true. There is not one single equivalence regime, it's a patchwork of regulations, and there are major bits of legislation with no equivalence provisions in at all. The cross-border payments regulation, Motor Insurance Distribution Directive, the Single European Payments Area. None of these have equivalence provisions, so we respectively are asking for something additional, and one of the answers the Minister's given isn't really correct.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his thoughtful intervention, but all we are seeking is straightforward equivalence in financial services, and that is something that the European Union has said that they will review, and we will know the conclusions of that review by June.
Well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What an excellent statement from the Secretary of State outlining our principles. But could he give me the assurance that the principles will not change when the EU says no to something? Because over the last few years I've listened to excellent speeches from that dispatch box, only to find our principles changed when the EU said no to something.
I am a restless seeker after consensus, wherever it can be found, but more important than that, I'm a Democrat. The British people were clear in the referendum and clear again in the general election. They wanted us to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister made clear in the general election, as he did during the referendum campaign, that meant leaving the single market, leaving the customs union and leaving the jurisdiction of the ECJ, and we will not move from those principles.
Jonathan Edwards.
Regrettably, the British Government, in its statement today, has decided to take a belligerent approach to the second phase of Brexit negotiations. Its opening move is to try and reopen the agreement reached after the first phase of Brexit and set further arbitrary deadlines for the infinitely more complicated second phase of Brexit dealing with trade. Rather than playing Russian roulette with people's jobs and economic well-being, would it not be better for the government to take a grown-up approach to these negotiations and remove any arbitrary deadlines to the conclusions of the negotiations?
There are no arbitrary deadlines. The deadline for agreement on the 31st of December is in the political declaration. If we were to take that out, we would be altering the political declaration. We're honouring the political declaration, and far from being belligerent, all we are simply doing is setting a deadline. When I was an editor in the world of newspapers, setting a deadline for correspondence was not an exercise in belligerence. It was a way of making sure that we could serve the people.
Or a trot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that we have higher standards in the EU in a number of areas, particularly, I would point out, in maternity, and it might be useful for the EU to recognise this in some of their discourse?
My honourable friend is absolutely bang on. Across the nations and the countries of the continent of Europe, there are different approaches to some of these questions, and it is the case that there are countries outside the European Union, like Norway, that have exemplary standards in environmental protection and also when it comes to maternity and social rights. The UK, like Norway, is a progressive, liberal, modern country, and that is something across this House that we should celebrate, and outside the European Union we can aim even higher.
Grant Davis.
That was successful.
Mr Speaker, the Minister knows that Canada, South Korea, Japan aren't in the single market. They aren't in the customs union, so we're starting from a different position. And therefore, will he accept that if we do diverge from EU environmental standards and workers' rights, inevitably there'll be restrictions? And so isn't his plan really to lose British jobs and simply blame the EU? And wouldn't it be better to keep up the standards and keep up the trade, because people didn't vote to lose their jobs when they voted to leave the EU?
I completely understand where the honourable gentleman is coming from, but we've had a referendum, we've had a general election. In both, it was very clear that we were going to leave the single market and the customs union, take back control in the interest of the British people.
David Dewitt.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I very much welcome the statement and the document to which my right honourable friend refers. And I particularly welcome the clarification, the increased clarification and increased detail on the subjects of fisheries, not least that it's going to be wholly, and I'm quoting from the statement, a wholly separate agreement from the free trade agreement, where we'll take back control of our waters as an independent coastal state and will not link access to our waters to access to EU markets. Can my right honourable friend confirm to the House and to the constituents of Banff and Buchan, particularly the seafood sector, both catchers and the processing side of the sector, that we will retain sovereignty, we will get the best deal for our fishermen across the United Kingdom, despite the assertions from the EU and despite the seemingly wishful thinking sometimes from the members opposite on SNP benches?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. For folk in Banff and Buchan, Murray, and indeed across the United Kingdom, a sea of opportunity beckons when we leave the European Union, and it is a great, great pity that the SNP and the Scottish Government, despite the many talented members that it enjoys, still wants us to remain in the EU and in the common fisheries policy. It's one of a number of ways in which they would sell Scotland short, and it grieves my heart.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just following that response here, today has governments ignored the vote of Scotland in the referendum, ignored the compromise proposals from the Scottish Government, and are showing they're willing to ride roughshod over the Seoul Convention. Now reneged on his offer, in his cherry vote leave, that Scotland could have its own immigration policy. Yep. So what one of these aspects is strengthening the so-called precious union?
Well, we are respecting the referendum result. In 2014, the people of Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom, and sadly, this is a settled decision which the Scottish Government seeks to unpick to the detriment of all. And then, having voted to be in the United Kingdom, the whole United Kingdom voted to leave whole and entire from the European Union, and we are working to make sure that that democratic decision works in the interests of all.
Stephen Happen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement today? And can I say to him, as he knows, that primarily the UK is a service-based sector economy. And whilst I hear taking back borders means a separate treaty for fishing, which many in coastal communities will welcome, constituents in my constituency of Wimbledon are in financial services and probably represent more than employed by the whole of fishing in the UK. On the basis we've talked about control of our money and taking back control of our money, why not a separate treaty for financial services? And if not, I've heard his comments on equivalence. Will he set out what the government's position on equivalence is in terms of the derivation period?
It is the case, as my honourable friend makes clear, financial services matter not just in Wimbledon but across the United Kingdom, and that is why we want to ensure, as is made clear in the document that we published today, that we wish to conclude an agreement which will make provision for financial stability, market integrity and investor and consumer protection for financial services. And it is also the case that we want to secure mutual recognition of professional qualifications as well, in order to ensure that everyone in our service sector can continue to have access to the opportunities in every market in which they currently work.
Elmore.
Mr Speaker, can I ask the Minister for further information in relation to the chapter on digital? In the report, I quote, it says, open, secure and trustworthy online environment and encourage regulatory cooperation. With the Government moving to tackle issues around online harms and the platforms, could he set out in more detail what he means by ensuring that there is cooperation on regulation in any future trading agreement?
Yes, absolutely. It is the case, as the honourable gentleman knows, that we are compliant with all the GDPR regulation. that the EU introduced, and we want to make sure that we get an equivalency judgment from the EU on data adequacy, and on that basis that we can continue to ensure that the data flows, which are so integral to business and others, can continue in an appropriate way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend's statement, both for the clarity and the optimism included in it. I know the people of Montgomeryshire, and indeed the majority of the people of Wales, will welcome that. Can I ask him to meet with the Welsh farming unions to outline again that we will not be seeking to lower food standards and tackle some of the scaremongering? And indeed, if my right honourable friend wants to do that of a Welsh farmhouse breakfast, we can certainly do that in Montgomeryshire.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. Whether it's the Farmers Union of Wales or NFU Cymru, farmers in Wales have brilliant representation, including from my honourable friend, the member for Montgomeryshire, and there is nothing nicer than a Welsh farmhouse breakfast, apart from possibly an Ulster fry, or a bacon sandwich in Peterhead Harbour.
Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister states that the negotiation will take place without prejudice to the Northern Irish Protocol, but there's confusion in Northern Ireland where we hear from the EU that there will be no derogation from the rules, but we have reports over the weekend of your government seeking to find ways around the protocol, and yourself and your colleague saying that there will still be unfettered access and no border in the Irish Sea. Can the Minister please describe in detail the crystal clarity you've referred to, how these irreconcilable aims will be married up, how people in Northern Ireland will finally get certainty after 3.5 years of bluster and stalled investment, and will he clarify what form the negotiation with the devolved administration will take?
Far from there being confusion, I hope that there is clarity, that we will implement the withdrawal agreement, respect the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then conclude a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union that will work in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland and people across the United Kingdom. It is the case that I've had profitable conversations with both the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in the preparation of our approach today. We won't always agree with every party in Northern Ireland, but all parties in Northern Ireland, including her own, have an important role to play in making sure that we deliver for all of the people of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for the reassurance he gives to our fisheries, which is particularly relevant to the fisheries in my constituency, beautiful Hastings and Rye. And does my right honourable friend agree that the point of leaving the EU is to enable us to make our own laws in our own way by politicians which we elect and who are accountable to the British people?
Well, honourable friend gets absolutely to the heart of the matter. Democratic accountability, as outlined brilliantly and eloquently by the father of the member for Leeds Central in this House and elsewhere, is something that all of us should celebrate and that leaving the European Union allows us to enhance.
Green.
Rightly acknowledges the importance of the SIS2 database, which holds many millions of pieces of data on wanted and missing persons, including vulnerable children. The document also says that if progress is not made by June sufficient to suggest that there will be the basis of an agreement by September, the government will begin to make its own preparations for domestic priorities. Can the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster explain how he will protect this country properly if we have to sacrifice the access that we have now to millions of pieces of vital data and rely on an Interpol database that contains only a few 100,000 records?
The Honourable Lady makes a very important point. And it is the case that we would like to continue to have access to not just the Schengen Information System 2 database, but also PRUM, ECRIS and a number of other law enforcement and criminal justice tools. But of course, we will have to see what approach the European Union takes. I'm hopeful that they will take a pragmatic approach because they benefit just as much, if not more, from our participation in these databases as we do. But it is also the case that leaving the European Union does allow us, through control of our own borders and laws, to improve homeland security in a number of ways, and we will always act in the interests of the British people.
Locksmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that the UK and the EU will trade together under an Australia-style agreement if one cannot be reached by the end of the year?
Friend is absolutely right. We want to have a comprehensive free trade agreement on the model that I've outlined in my statement, but if not, then there are other great countries, including Australia, New Zealand and of course the United States, that have a huge volume of trade with the EU without having an agreement of that kind.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. You don't level up by damaging foundations, and that's exactly what would happen to the economy by walking away in June, as the government's been briefing this morning. But also, as my honourable friend has said, you would do damage to our security. Now, the document says very clearly there should be no role for the CJEU in resolving UK-EU disputes. So does that mean the government's happy not only to lose access potentially to databases crucial to our security, but also the European arrest warrant?
It is ultimately a question for the EU. We are clear that we want a relationship of sovereign equals. If the EU attaches to that relationship a requirement that we follow the jurisdiction of their courts, that is not a relationship of sovereign equals, and it will be the security of the EU that would be impinged as well. And I am sure that no European politician would willingly want to sacrifice the security of their people by taking anything other than a constructive approach.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I came to this place, I had a job representing the banking industry in negotiations with in the wake of the Brexit referendum with the EU, the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council, as well as the Bank of England and the Treasury, on what sort of relationship we want with the EU after Brexit. And one thing we came to realise quite quickly, as did the Bank of England, and Mark Carney has spoken on this point, that as a global financial centre, to be a rule taker and have no say over our prudential regulation would be a threat to financial stability for the UK. Does my right honourable friend agree that actually we have to be very careful and there's a real threat to becoming a rule taker for financial services?
100% spot on, totally correct.
Speaker, yesterday, as a member of the Defence Select Committee, I heard from Professor Malcolm Charners of RUSI, who stated the risks to the UK's essential alliance relationships are greater now than they have ever been for many decades. So I wonder if the Secretary of State could advise the House why the statement on our future relationships with the European Union and about maintaining and say absolutely nothing about maintaining and improving defence.
Well, when it comes to maintaining and improving defence, we have a network of relationships, including, of course, our membership of NATO, the strongest and most durable alliance for freedom that the world has ever known. But when it also comes to defending this country, one of the most perilous things that we could do would be to follow the Scottish Government's approach of breaking up the United Kingdom and the Scottish Government's approach of unilateral nuclear disarmament. I'm afraid that the SNP's position on defence, like its position on so many other issues, would mean that the Scottish people would be less safe as a direct result of their ideological attachment to separation.
Matthew Pennicook.
Mr. Speaker, in light of the Minister's remarks on level playing field, can I ask him about competition policy and governance arrangements? Is it the government's position that in relation to commitments on workers' rights, on environmental protections, consumer and social standards, that the government would accept them being subject to any dispute resolution mechanism agreed to as part of the wider agreement?
It is the case that there will be... there was a list, I know, that the honourable gentleman put forward. I'll come back to each of those in correspondence. Some of them would be covered by dispute resolution mechanisms, others may not be.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland also cast its biggest ever voting proposition when it voted 62% to remain in the EU. More people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU than voted to remain within the United Kingdom. And also that was using the franchise of the UK government. Had 16 and 17-year-olds been trusted the way we do in Scotland, trust our youth, there would have been a bigger proportion to remain within the EU. Does he truly believe withholding the sovereign right of the Scottish people is a sustainable position going forward? And while protecting the sovereignty of the UK, is he prepared to deny the sovereignty of Scotland?
Well, I know that it is the case that the Scottish Nationalist Party will always... I don't know why... I'm sorry. Facts are shields that win a ding, as Robert Brown said. I'm afraid the representatives on that bench are nationalists. They are nationalists. They put the separation of the smashing up of the United Kingdom ahead of anything else. Some of them are personally decent and kind people, but I'm afraid they're nationalists. And the reason they object so much is that when the mask comes off and we recognise the ideological heart of the SNP, they didn't like it up them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If agreement's reached, it's estimated there's going to be a need for about 50,000 new customs officers. Is it feasible to recruit and train that many people in less than 6 months, and who's going to foot the bill for it?
Good question.
Yes, it is, and the government stands behind it.
Stephen Parry.
Does the Minister recognise that even the most far-reaching and comprehensive free trade agreement is sadly still going to see regulatory checks and rules of origin checks down the Irish Sea? And as such, beyond simply giving a rhetorical commitment around the implementation of the protocol, can the Minister assure not just the House but his his negotiating partners in the European Union that the government is actually preparing to implement that protocol?
We will ensure that the protocol is appropriately implemented, and we will also ensure unfettered access for businesses in Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK market.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, Brexit will be extremely damaging for Scotland in a whole range of ways. The difference between myself and the Secretary of State is that he's a British nationalist and I'm a Scottish nationalist.
Indeed.
But can he tell me if he thinks that Brexit imposed on Scotland will increase or decrease constitutional tensions across the UK?
Britain leaving the European Union will mean that there is a greater degree of harmony between every part of the United Kingdom. And I recognise that will be a disappointment to the Scottish Nationalist Party in its restless search for grievance, dissension and division. But one of the things that I can't help saying is that even though I profoundly disagree with the SNP, it's so lovely to have so many SNP MPs here in the Westminster Parliament, and I know that for many, many, many years to come there will be representation for Scotland here in Westminster, and that's a lovely thing.
We now